All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Seary. I'm the Executive Director of Communications and Development at Foundations, Inc. And I want to thank you for joining us again for one of our Perspectives from the Field webinar series. Just to give you a little bit of background about Foundations, Inc., we are a national education nonprofit. We're located in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And our mission is to improve the quality of education by strengthening the skills of educators. So we work across the school day. We work in after-school programs, in classrooms, at the district level, and even at the state level to create a brighter future for every child every day. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about Foundations, Inc., you can take a minute to follow us on social media or check us out on our website, and we'll make sure all of that information is in the chat for you. But before we get started today, I do want to give a special shout out to the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for making this series possible. Our 2022-2023 Perspective series is all about representation, and we allow each of our special guests to provide their own unique perspective on this topic, whether it's the importance of mentorship, diversity and leadership roles, relatable role models, or anything else that comes up. Another thing I'd like to mention is our signature professional learning experience, the Beyond School Hours Conference. You might know us already from this. Our conference is held each year in February, and in 2023, we're celebrating our 26th year. We're going to be back in Orlando, Florida from February 9th through the 12th, and we hope that you will all join us. Registration is open, the room block is filling up, so please take a moment and register. And now I would like to welcome our amazing host, Shawn Petty, and today's special guest, Jessica Wetzel, Vice President of Programs and Quality at Techbridge Girls. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. It's so good to be here, Elizabeth. What a great, exciting day. I don't know where you're at exactly. You're up in the Northeast, I believe.
Yeah, Philly, and it's a little chilly today.
Is it? Like, it's for us in Texas, where I am in San Antonio, it's like 55 degrees, which means we're in sweaters. So, yeah. But Jessica's coming to us all the way from California, I believe.
I am. And, it's in the 60s in California, which means we're in puffers and boots because we don't know how to live in the cold. So, yes, I'm joining from Southern California, LA area. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are so excited. Thank you, Elizabeth, for introducing us. Thank you, Paula, for providing our tech support and getting us all up and running. And then Jessica, thank you for taking time out of your crazy busy schedule to come chat with us today about representation and everything that means.
We're so grateful. Grateful. Thank you for having me.
No, well, we have about 33 folks on the line, but we'll have a lot more views and probably folks joining us in time. But our audience is from all across the nation. And this may be, I know you're pretty well known, so people may already know you and they may be here because they know you. But just in case, can you tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are?
Yeah, so I currently serve as Vice President of Programs with Techbridge Girls. We develop curriculum for the out-of-school space to ensure that BIPOC girls and gender-expansive youth have a safe, welcoming, and belonging environment in STEM. I come to this work with a deep passion for out-of-school time. I've been in the out-of-school time space for over a decade now, starting out with Girls Inc., working in a local affiliate to develop programs, and then also with our national organization to scale college-bound programming, STEM programming, and develop models that our affiliate sisters could use across the nation. So, I'm really, really excited to be here and always happy to be in community with fellow mentors, educators, all of those things.
Well, thank you. It's amazing. So our topic today is representation. That's kind of what we're focused on. So when you hear that word, what does that mean to you?
I mean, honestly, I think we really have a narrow story that we tell about who belongs in what spaces. But the truth is there are so many folks that don't look like that stock story of STEM, for instance, right? There are so many folks doing great things in STEM that don't look like Albert Einstein or the folks you see on Big Bang Theory. So to
Sure.
me, representation is about ensuring that those stories are front and center, so that young people can see them, so that our communities can see them, so that everyone knows that they have a history and a place in these different settings, particularly in STEM, where we know there are so many groups that just are underrepresented and marginalized in those spaces. So it's really just highlighting the true stories of STEM coming from a really diverse place rather than this narrow story we see.
No, thank you. I love some of the analogies you meant there. Or you shared there. It's so true. Like, I work a lot in the after school field. I work with secondary students, and I'll ask them about science, and it never fails. They do give me that Albert Einstein-esque type of figure. That's who they envision.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, but there's so many facets to science, and so why is it this? And so I like the fact that you brought that up. But when you were young, did you have this dream that you're going to grow up to be what you are today, or was it an evolution?
I would say it was an evolution. I went to school, to one of the first in my family to go to college. And I went to school thinking I was going to be a teacher. And part of that was because of the huge influence teachers and folks who acted as educators had on my life. And then I sort of got there to the space of learning in that area and realized, like, back to stories, teachers are beholden to tell a really narrow story. And ultimately what are educators, right? They're storytellers. They're telling the story of our history, our past, our present, our future through all these knowledge and skills, but also the folks who have engaged in them. So I got there and realized the folks in my life who had told me the most true and meaningful stories were people who were in out of school time spaces. They were people who were in YMCAs and after school programs that were caregivers to me, and had the opportunity to kind of open my mind in a way that I didn't feel that I could do as a traditional educator. So it evolved. And then I got involved in nonprofits and really realized the power of nonprofit, particularly in youth development and education. And so my trajectory definitely evolved to where I am today, because I kind of got a more holistic view of what education means, right? And it's not just that teacher in the classroom, it's that person, but it's also this whole community of folks who act as educators for our young people.
So would you say on this journey of getting to where you are today, like, let's go back in time to like young Jessica, and when Jessica was like in elementary school and everything, were there certain things that you noticed even back then that really hit home with you, and now that you look back, you're like, oh, that kind of guided my thinking to where I am today? Or were there some disparities that you saw even back then that you were like, wow, I'm going to tackle this, or this doesn't feel right?
I feel like the stories I heard as a young person were like, specifically around race and gender, were often like, good thing we had all these people who came before who fixed the problem. Like, let's learn about them and celebrate all their work, right? So I was always inspired, by the stories we hear about brilliant people making change when it comes to social justice and racial and gender equity. But I feel like when I got into high school and college, there was a shift in that the way that this was presented was that the problem was fixed and we could celebrate all the people who fixed it, and yay for a good new world we can enter. And I was sort of like, blinded by my privilege and my whiteness to be like, I believe that, right? And then there was a time, when I started like reading more and learning more in high school, where I'm like, oh, like the work's not done, we can't say the work is done when it comes to equity and justice. And the story I've been told kind of led us to believe that. And obviously so many of my peers knew that wasn't true. But I was late to understanding that. And because of that, my eyes kind of opened to like my responsibility and all of that, I would say. Yeah.
Was there like a defining moment when that happened? Like, or was it a series of moments, or?
I mean, I guess I don't know. I think it was a series of moments. I think it was, when I think about college, I went to college in like 2000, in when the Obama administration was beginning, when there was a lot of revelation for me around just how unjust this country could be. In California, there were laws being passed to try to kind of prohibit gay marriage at that time. And I feel like I just had this aha moment like in early college of like, oh, the work's not done. There's still so much work to do. And how have I been so blind to it? So it could have been politics in some ways that opened my eyes, just starting to follow, like, get more civically engaged and follow that. And I started like, and I'm kind of digressing away from out of school time, but I started volunteering as a poll worker, early in college and becoming more tuned into like policy and politics. And I think probably a lot of that came from that really tense time around President Obama running and stuff like that. I think there were some aha moments there for sure.
Okay, I mean that's fascinating to discover. Like, President Obama was running for office. A lot of things are coming out about, like you said, some folks are like, hey, race is over. Our issues with race and equality is over. We elected a Black man as a president. No more worries, right? Like everything's great. And then you're observing things in California, some policy stands that you don't necessarily support and that the state doesn't support, but are being pushed. And you're like, wow, this is crazy. So you got into some advocacy work there.
Yeah. I mean, I think every time we make progress, it also reveals how far we still have left to go. Right. And I feel like that was kind of the truth of my trajectory through education, is like, every time I made progress and sort of learning about the world around me, I also was more in tune and enlightened to like all the work that was still to be done and the responsibility that I could have in that, right?
So with that in mind, so it's high school, you're going to college. Now, did you take a traditional college route, or did you go a different type of college route? Like what's the story there?
Yeah, I started out in community college,
Okay.
I had a single dad, raised by, my grandparents in a lot of ways. And so I didn't have a lot of like, you're going to college support around me. And the idea of a 4-year college wasn't necessarily something I heard all the time or had people who were in tune to supporting me with. So I went to a local community college. And it was an excellent experience. It was like a place to really discover more, a place to really explore, and like an accessible way to do that. So I went to community college, transferred to a 4-year, and then, got into nonprofit work. And I just did my master's about 2 years ago. So waited a while to kind of figure out what my next step was.
That's crazy. I love the fact though that you shared that you went to community college, because that's a little different than what sometimes what we focus on, like or we're told to focus on sometimes by our leadership. It's like, get kids to a college 4-year degree, go this route, and community colleges are there, but we're like, yeah, let's focus over there. And yet you had this amazing experience.
Yeah. And I mean, I've worked with girls for years who, in their case, it's like they have the potential to be the first generation to ever go to college. And so it's really important that we, give them the opportunities that they might be eligible for when it comes to 4-year colleges, and give them the whole gamut, but also knowing that community college is a great option for them to feel a sense of belonging, to start, getting a little more comfortable with the idea of college, on like a little bit of a slower, I don't know if it's slower, but just like a little bit more of a, not low stakes per se, but I guess it gives you the opportunity to really make some decisions in those 2 years that maybe you had to already make when you get into a 4-year college, gives you some time to plan, some time to explore, especially if you have not been used to like college going culture,
Yeah. So, and then, you went on to get your 4-year degree, and then you said did you go right out of college into nonprofit work, or did you go into a different, what was your next step?
Yeah, I went into after school programs. I was like teaching art and managing some programs that did art enrichment after school. So working in the after school space really. And then I got into Girls Inc. And for me, that's where I started to realize like the power of the nonprofit sector, right? Because there's a lot of freedom to tell the stories we want to tell when it comes to nonprofit education and youth development. And there's also a lot of responsibility in nonprofits, right? Like we often sit at this sort of intersection of like these policy failures and the challenges that the public sector faces, and then also these failures at the private sector level, right? So there's a real responsibility and opportunity when we think about the nonprofit space. So I was really inspired by that work, and then decided to go get a Master's of Public Administration with a focus on nonprofit management because of that. So that's where I ended up today.
So now what inspired you to go into the master's program though? I mean, you were working with a nonprofit, you're getting a name, you're making a difference, you're doing stuff. So why go back?
I spent my days in my office doing my admin side of my work, managing staff, directing the program, often spent my afternoons with youth, right? And whether that be going from doing a budget to driving the van after school. And I was always like creating an environment for them where I wanted them to know they could do hard things and they should challenge themselves and they should go to community college if that felt right, but also challenge themselves to like take that admission that they got to the 4-year. And I just, at the time, I wasn't really living that myself. So it was kind of like they inspired me, right? I saw the girls doing a lot of hard things and being really courageous in that. And so I was like, I've been wanting to go back to school, but I always have excuses and I'm always supporting girls and not shying away from the hard stuff. So I decided to kind of practice what I preach in some ways.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, what an interesting story. So, I'm going to go back. You mentioned that, you were kind of raised by a dad and grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's a little unusual. A lot of times there's a growing single family or single parent is a growing field, so to speak. It's the numbers are staggering right now, but a lot of times it's just the opposite. It's a mom and a child, or sometimes grandparents and child. But to have a dad, that was a little different, right? Did you find that well, it had to have like changed some of the ways you view things, right?
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to that idea of like belonging, right? Like I knew that I was one of the only. I knew that my life was a little different than others. I had friends with single parents, but really none of them had a single dad. We didn't have a lot of sleepovers at my house and stuff like that because moms are usually the one who coordinate all the things and do all that. And then my grandparents are older, right? So I was raised in a lot of ways by like another generation of folks who wasn't as tuned in to what. So while I got a lot of exposure to like Matlock and Murder, She Wrote and cool things that I love now, I know that I also had this sort of gap in my like knowledge sometimes because I was being raised by folks from another world in a lot of ways. So at that time, like my caregivers were wonderful, and after school programs and like youth development programs were such a critical part of my like development because I didn't like my grandma didn't talk about college or things that were like pertinent to me as a young growing up person. We had a different relationship, right? So I got a lot of that knowledge and information about what my path could be from folks that were in out of school time that were primary caregivers until someone could pick me up, at the end of the day. So.
And you said you were a first generation college, like you're the first in your.
Yeah, I mean, none of my sisters went to college. So I do have sporadic, folks, but yeah, I mean, we really didn't have a college going culture. Definitely some folks didn't finish high school, in my immediate family. So, and at the same time, I have older sisters who were also caregivers to me. And I feel like probably didn't do a lot of things so that they could kind of lift me up and help me to do those things in some ways. Right. So yeah, I didn't grow up thinking a lot about like what my college major would be or like what I'm going to be when I grow up. Like, I feel like I didn't necessarily have that push or that culture in my house,
I think that's really cool because that's a great story for some of the students that we work with. I mean, how many students that we work with are the same way? They're first generation. They may be from a single parent household, or they may have, guardians or extended family taking care of them. And yeah, you're right. A lot of times the focus in school is to do well and go to college. You hear it, but to really absorb what that means. And then you see,
Yeah.
yeah, you
And the
see,
adults around you make a lot of assumptions about what you know or don't know about college and what the steps are, right? And when we make those assumptions, then we're further like showing youth that they don't belong, right? That they're not speaking our language, that they're not part of this club. So it's just so important to get to know the youth in the room, get to understand their history and their homes and what they're doing and what they're interested in, so that we can hear that stuff and then know how to like support them. And I think sometimes we don't have time in traditional education to do that, to like truly see where our students are coming from and truly like hear from them and then be able to speak to them more authentically about their path and our own.
So with all that in mind, and your origin story, I guess you could say, from your origin and where you came today, what led you to focus on, advocating for particularly like girls in STEM, or representation of young women, or those who identify as such? You could have gone anywhere. You could have gone Greenpeace, and you could have gone like battling climate change, or you could have gone into battling for a different cause. Why this cause? Why do what you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably some unspoken things in there. I didn't necessarily, other than grandmothers, I and sisters, like we didn't have sort of that female figure. So there could be something in there like that I need to tease out in a therapy session or something. But honestly, I came to Girls Inc. by happenstance. And when I got there, the youth that I worked with had such they were so impacted by the things that our culture tells us about what it means to be a girl, what it means to be, whatever your origin is, right? And they were so impacted by that, and it was so clearly disproportionate. Like, oftentimes we tell people, you can learn and do better at this. And I saw young girls who were like, I'm inherently not good at math, and so I was just my eyes were so opened in those classrooms early on. And even in art classes, like where I saw how girls had already put themselves on the path of what they're interested in, not because of what they were truly interested in, but because of how they were socialized around them, right? You're going to be good at art, but you don't probably need to focus on these other things. And I saw that early on. And when I got to Girls Inc. and I could like have honest discussions about where that came from and their identities, and like how their identities were all tied up in these big concepts that no one had ever talked to them about, but they knew inherently. I felt like that was just where I needed to be, like in a space where I could have honest conversations with kids. So it wasn't so much about like them being girls. It was just like a space where we could talk about justice and the world around them in a way that was honest and real, and then also empower them to like understand that history, the world, and then speak about it openly too. So that I just want to be in spaces where I can have deep thoughts with kids and like encourage that thinking and encourage these relationships that are authentic between kids and adults. And I was really inspired early on, even in my art classes and stuff, to have those conversations with kids. And Girls Inc. gave me a path for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, at Girls Inc., it was like I would take girls to these science environments, right? I would take them to a lab, and we would be so pumped about a lab. And then I'd get there and we'd face an adult who just was perpetuating all of these things, right? We'd face somebody who'd say, I don't know how to pronounce your name, so I'm going to call you this, to our girls who had like beautiful Indigenous names, right? So I started to realize the power that these people were having, right? Like, I could say all day, you're going to be a scientist. You have all these history and science. Look at you. You have all these attributes of science. But when you get in front of a scientist and they say, you don't belong here, in whatever way they say that,
Sure.
That is persistent, and that is the truth. And so Techbridge Girls gives us an opportunity to think about, like, how do we equip those adults to understand that they are responsible for like disrupting that they're responsible for creating spaces where girls can thrive. Not that the girls are responsible for it. I spent a long time teaching girls how to be strong, smart, and bold. And now's the time to show adults to get out of the way, right? make sure that they're creating spaces where their brilliance can shine. And science is a really important place to do that because we need all their brains to help us in this world.
I love that. Get out of their way so that we can allow their brilliance to shine and empower them to do so, But I want to go back to something that you said that just really hit home with me, and that is, you've really pumped these students up and you take them to, a place, and there may be an engineer or a STEM focused career leader there, and they said something like, I can't pronounce your name. So instead of saying, can you break it down for me, or can you help me understand so that I can, say it, they're just like, so I'm going to call you Al, or I'm going to call you this name, which is, a lot of times people don't realize how dehumanizing that is for people. Like, because in many cultures, the name is super, super, super important. Like I grew up in the islands of the Pacific, like Hawaii, and like names have meaning. So if you take my name away, you're like taking away my meaning. So how do you work with that? I mean, how do you work with folks who for various reasons, I'm assuming positive intent, so they mean to be positive, but they end up going back into these unique areas where they may not know, or sometimes maybe they don't care. Well, how do you deal with that? Like, how do we deal with that? Because I think folks on the line deal with that every day.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been moments in my life where I've been like, the girls are ready to be here. And because of like my age, being a white woman, like didn't do my due diligence to prepare the adults in the room or to vet like the situation. Like I think in youth development, we often think like we're going to prepare the girls to be part of this community, but really inclusivity means we want to include someone in something as is. What we need to do is expand that space. We need to be expansive, right? So to do that, we need the adults in that space to understand their role, their position. And I think in out of school time, like what I learned over and over again is that I really don't need to be teaching the girls to like code switch or be different in that space. What I need to spend my energy on is meeting with these adults who are going to come and be partners with us, and find ways to talk to them about their responsibility in that space, and have open conversations about race and gender, because we often just shy away from those conversations. We want to be grateful to the person who invited us to their lab. But in doing so, we are sometimes not doing our due diligence to make sure that environment is one that our girls can thrive in. So, that's what I try to do throughout the years is like, as I learned, I can process with the girls afterward, but what I should be doing ahead of time is spending less time trying to get the girls to understand how to sit down and be quiet and more time talking to the adults ahead of time to say, hey, this is what we do here. These are who the girls are. And these are the expectations we have when we bring girls into a space. How can we have a discussion about that? And I'm grateful to be at Techbridge Girls because we have tools for that, because that's not always easy to do. We have trainings, we have webinars to talk to people about, bias and preparing adults to be disruptors of that. So I think it's just like less about teaching our girls to code switch and be different, and more about thinking about the adults in their life and how we can be brave and disrupt those spaces, like while it's happening, but also before, like doing our due diligence.
Thank you so much. And Anna says good point, and Dr. Bevins is adding in as well. So I'm going to get to Anna's question in just a second about some resources, but I want to go back to this idea that you mentioned and I think it's very profound. A lot of times when we do the show or when I talk to various people, it is about like working with the youth to empower the youth. Like it's like, the focus is you need to stand up for yourself. You need to fight for every inch you get. You need to do this. And your approach is a little different. It's like, yes, you do need to advocate for yourself. We all need to be comfortable in our own selves, but there is this world that we live in, and whether it be a systematic barrier or something that was in place from time, or it be the person's own individual lens that they're looking at the world through, we might want to take it on the opposite side too. We may want to, yes, we're bringing a group of young women or young students overall, we're bringing them to this location, but hey, we're going to prep the location before they come so that this is a positive experience for both. Is that, have you found that to be a unique approach, or more and more people doing that approach?
I mean, I think there's more and more resources out there. I mean, Learning for Justice has really good resources for adults. The National Equity Project has wonderful resources, particularly for people in education, to empower us to have these discussions with other adults. We have resources that I could share after around this, but you know, I think it's really, really important that we all understand our responsibility. I think that's the main thing. Like when I talk to adults, I don't know that they think that one-time interaction can have the power. But when you talk about young people, oftentimes what they bring up is that one time when that one educator made them feel like they fit. That one time when that one adult said something that shut them down and made them feel like their identity wasn't welcome there. So like we can have kids for 12 weeks every day after school, or we can have them for 45 minutes after school, hosting them in our workplace. And the power that we have is so hard to describe to people who they're not around kids, they're not around young people. They don't see themselves as playing a big role in that. So I think part of this is just all of us realizing that we are responsible for this, and that we have a lot of power to like shape the way that a girl can think about herself and can feel like she belongs. So I think part of it is like being authentic in that understanding, telling girls unique stories about STEM, our own stories, and then being brave and bold when we step into spaces to hold people accountable for that. And it's not easy. I mean, you know, this person that I encountered, like I look back and I processed with the girls, we talked about it, we used it as a learning moment, and then I just didn't go there again, you know. And looking back on that, like that I took that opportunity away from the girls. And I also, how many girls and young people came after that had the same experience, because I didn't take that moment to really just say, hey, like this is why I view that as something that was, you know, not creating a safe space. So I think it's just about like finding community that we can lean on to be brave in those moments, no matter what we do with young people, you know?
So thank you. I'm going to unpack a little bit, but I do want to answer Anna's questions, or Anna or Anna, I'm not sure which, but as she asks, you know, are there any resources, of course, preferably free because of the world we work in, you know, that you'd recommend for adults, you know, around this concept? Like, is there something that Techbridge Girls puts out? Like you said, webinars. You mentioned a couple, you know, like the National Equity Center and some others. Any recommendations on some like resources? Again, preferably free, but I mean, if there's cost, that's understandable.
Yeah, I mean, reach out to me after, because we have many opportunities to give free things. So, but we have a Role Models Matter training, and I'm passionate about this because I would have sent it to Mr. I can't pronounce your name, man. And I would have seen, you know, but it's an asynchronous module where you can distribute it as like an education provider to people who you're partnering with, so that they can watch videos and respond to those videos. But it talks about bias, how it shows up, the intersection of race and gender, and how we fit as adult role models in that space, and our potential, or our potential to be great and to open doors, and also our potential to be a gatekeeper. And it takes about an hour for people to do. And I think it's really important, just because like I don't have time to sit down, you know, for an hour and explain all this to a person, and I might not be successful in that. But it's a tool that we can say, hey, like as part of what we do here, you know, in my center, we ask all adults who are going to engage with our young people to take this brief training, because it allows us to, you know, ensure that we're creating an equitable space. So it's a way to say it. And it's also a way to see how those folks might respond, right? Because there's like a module where they have to respond with some of their answers. So you can also vet some of those things. So that's one tool that we have. But I know that that's what's really important. We don't often have the time, especially as educators in traditional or out of school time space, to like do that work. And so that's one tool that I really love. But also like webinars and trainings through those organizations. We're starting a community of practice right now. where we're having folks come in, once a month, do some readings in between, and really talk about what it means to create an equitable space for young people, and how we can get tools together as a group, because I think community really is important, to get a community of folks who can share their experiences, their strategies, and also get some from folks working in the field like Techbridge Girls. So I think community is important, and I think resources that can be, shared so that our educators don't often always have to do that labor are really important. And we have some, and like I said, National Equity Project is a great one, Learning for Justice as well.
Perfect. So we do have a follow-up question. And also Dr. Bevins has been putting in the chat as well a lot of thoughts around. I want to point out to our audience so that the back channel is also being utilized and everything. So how can the folks online register for like role models matter training, or is that something we can share with them now or later? Or
yeah, I can get you the info for that after, so that it can be distributed for sure. For sure. We can definitely, especially give it to this group. We often have groups that want to track larger. So we talk with our partnerships team, and there'll be an evaluation, and we can do a little more, or we can just share you a link that you can pass on, and then, kind of monitor as your educators or role models use it. So I can definitely share that resource after.
Excellent. So letting everybody know. And then Paul is putting a link in there too for us. So, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. You can let me know. And I feel like that guy. I will call you by your name, just teach you how to do it, right? It's either Jeannie or Janae. Or Janae. Okay, thank you. She brings up a really good question that I was thinking too, is there, outside of the training, if you were to give me just a quick way, what is a way to vet the programs? Like we want the youth that we work with to have an amazing experience, and we don't want them to be turned away from an experience. And like you said, sometimes, and we don't think of it sometimes, we're like, we're going to take them to the planetarium, and that's just what we're going to do. And then we go there and they have an experience that we're like, oh my gosh, I wish I wouldn't have brought them here. Is there like a 3-point check or something that we can do? I don't know, something that we can kind of, and not so much that we want to avoid, but we just want to be aware and be like, okay, we need to, this may happen, we're going to address it. How can we vet programs? Anything you'd recommend or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it's really important to ask about their experience serving the populations that you're bringing. Like, I just think that's a really important, do you serve BIPOC girls and gender expansive youth? Like, do they come through here? Because oftentimes we find that, and I'm talking about, sometimes we work with corporations, right? And they're like, we want to welcome more kids of color into our organization. And they've literally never spoken to a child of color just because of their trajectory into their career. So I think it's really important to share who you're bringing and ask about their experience there. And then I also think, organizations often have support within them. So I think it's interesting and important to know what kind of support they have within their organization around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Oftentimes folks can say, oh yeah, we do training on this already. And you can get in there and ask a little more around that. And sometimes people will share that, they've taken a 1-hour course and they're experts. And then maybe you might think, let me dig a little bit more into that. So, I mean, my advice is really just to be honest about who you're serving and why, and ask them about their experience in welcoming those groups into their environment. I think oftentimes people want to shy away from those conversations, but having them up front is really important, and getting a couple good questions in there around their experience right off the bat would be really important.
So thank you. I'm gonna piggyback off that because you said something that I was just like, oh, this is great, because you mentioned, people may shy away from experience. So right now, the terms race, gender, equality, they sometimes get people down a spiral, and we all have different thoughts about things. And, the idea is that we talk and actually communicate to each other and learn and grow together. But what about, because it's so controversial sometimes, depending on where you are in the country or where your belief set is, how do you work in a space that's actually such a controversial space? Is that fair to ask you? I don't know.
I mean, yeah, I mean, we used to be a regional organization, and we worked in the Pacific Northwest, we worked in Oakland, and we worked in DC. So, oftentimes we were preaching to the choir when we talked about equity, when we were really focusing on identity. And now that we've expanded into many, many states, we are finding that we have barriers because folks will say, oh no, we don't talk about pronouns here, or that sounds a little too much based in race. So I think that's a real issue. And where I think it is important to focus is but everyone shows up with their identity. Their identity is what people see, what they don't see, but it informs how they engage with the world, right? And all we're asking people to do is make space within their community for identities that are different than theirs. So oftentimes when we start these conversations, it's not around how are you a perpetrator of oppression? It starts as, what identities do you have that are seen and unseen, right? Where do you come from?
Yeah.
And how does that intersect with where other people come from? So it's not about pointing fingers. It's about knowing that our identities shape the world around us and shape the way we're viewed, and also how we view ourselves as safe in spaces, belonging, brave in spaces. So I think getting people to think critically about their own identities is really important, and that will allow them to think about how their identity intersects with others. And sometimes it's about personal responsibility, but also it's about things that are outside of us, that are shaping the way that we're intersecting, the way that a youth might come and not feel safe because immediately they've had a negative experience with an educator, or they've had a positive experience and they feel safe in that space. So I think big picture, we need people to think about their own space in the world so that they can then, integrate how others might be interacting with that, and how they might be either welcoming or silencing other identities within that, and so starting from a space of common understanding, I think, is always important, rather than, oppressor in some ways. And we try to do that in our trainings, and it's not always easy. We do have spaces where Techbridge Girls is not there, because our curriculum is talking about critical consciousness. Our curriculum is centering race. Our curriculum is positioning STEM as a tool that can be used to also fight injustice in the world. And some people don't want to talk about that, but we're going to keep trying. I'm going to keep trying to speak people's language, because at the end of it, there are girls and girls of color who should hear this, right? And I'm trying to just get through to those people that are on the pathway, so that ultimately those girls can get that content. So we have to change how we talk about it in a lot of different settings. And oftentimes it starts with that first connection to someone's identity.
I think your approach is a really solid approach, and it comes from a place of heart, versus like you said, approaching and being like, hey, you're the oppressor, that instantly puts people in the defensive, and they may shut down and not listen. And yet, focus on the intersectionality of identity overall can help people to realize, oh yeah, that makes sense. I have two girls, and that happens, and I'm just thinking of my own experience, right? But Dr. Bevins brings into the chat a lot about the pre-pandemic, the COVID timeframe, and now what is being perceived by some as maybe a post-pandemic, but who knows, I want to dig into that a little bit. Do you feel during the pandemic, a lot of things happened in the country, politically, socially, from a social justice perspective, from an identity, from an education perspective? I mean, it really just kind of shook up the world for the past 2 years, or at least that's just my lens that I see it through. What would you say? Do you feel like things were getting better pre-COVID, and then we kind of backtracked, and now what do we do? Are things the same? Or what's your just general impression of the last 3 years? In 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see in here, like, we do have a unique moment here to reflect on the learning in the pandemic, and what the pandemic revealed was ultimately, educational inequities in many ways. It revealed the need for more support for educators. It revealed some of the challenges with standardized testing and bucketing students based on those things. I think a lot came up from an educational perspective. It revealed the true importance of out of school time, because often the only places open to help care for youth were, community centers that were doing after school programs and stuff in person throughout all the pandemic, so that our essential workers, as they were called, could remain in person. So I just think there was so much revealed when it comes to equity and justice around education and beyond. Working parents and the challenges faced there. And I want to say that we are taking that learning, into this next iteration of education, but I'm seeing like, oh my goodness, look at all this learning loss happening. How do we go back and fix these last 2 years? So I want to be positive and think that we will have a more expansive way of looking at how we engage with students. But I also see us falling on those old habits of like looking at the scores from the last 2 years and figuring out how we go back and fix it. But in that time, youth had access to more technology than ever before, and that was expanded so that most kids have a device that they can use, and most kids, got internet access at that time. It was, a lot was revealed around social emotional learning, and now there's a lot of dollars and support for more mental health support and more social emotional learning in school and out of school time. Those things are positive, as long as we don't use them as like ways to check a box in this intermediate time. As long as we maintain that understanding and don't just say, there's funding for this right now, throw it there, let's add an extra class, and then let's be done with it next year because now the social emotional learning money has died or something. So, I think there is the potential for it to be a passing phase, but I definitely understand and see more support for mental health. And to me, that's critical because access to mental health services is not equitable. And so more schools being able to provide spaces for mental health is critical. Huge positive that come out of the pandemic. But now I'm digressing. So
No, I appreciate that, because it brings heart to me, because you've shared, that coming out of the pandemic, there's been this increased focus on social, emotional, and mental health, trauma-informed care in that field. Mm-hmm. I would agree, but I do think there's also this huge push for this accelerated learning perspective. Mm-hmm. And I worry about that. Mm-hmm. I think that I agree with that. I mean, who wouldn't want to stand on their soapbox and be like, kids should do well academically? I mean, that's, mm-hmm. we want them to achieve, but on the opposite coin, are we throwing, everything out the window because we're trying to do one thing? And so I'm glad to hear that you have a belief that, the mental health, the social emotional learning, and that aspect has grown. So thank you. What about, so Anne brings up a good question, and mm-hmm. she asks, do you ever allow, I'm going to read it verbatim just because mm-hmm. I don't want to paraphrase. Do you ever allow underserved boys in the program or activities? Mm-hmm. I have slightly mixed feelings about the STEM programs that are the many STEM programs that may be aligned specifically for girls, mm-hmm. or focused on girls. Mm-hmm. Like, can you share a little bit? Because that's for some of our viewers, that's kind of a tough spot. We're like, we want all kids to succeed, but there's so many for girls. What do we do?
Yeah. I mean, we now are, we have the curriculum, but we work with partners all over the country who deliver it, right? And who are trained in our gender responsive and culturally relevant practices, and then deliver the curriculum. And in those groups, there are often boys who are part of it. And I don't think anyone has ever turned away from the program. It is girl focused in that the experiences and the identities of girls, particularly girls of color, are centered in the curriculum. for instance, we talk about bias in AI, right, in one of our programs, and we learned that through the story of Joy Bulamwini, who's an amazing computer scientist who worked to kind of uplift this disparity of who develops AI and then therefore who it's kind of for, and challenges the notion of AI being for and by white folks. And so that, right, is equally important for everyone to hear. Boys should also be seeing stories of girls and women who are doing amazing things in STEM. Boys should also understand that STEM histories are not this narrow focus that we often think of, or gendered. So while we do definitely write it for the experience of anyone who experiences girlhood, and we definitely center the identities of women and gender expansive folks of color, it is super important for boys to also see that the definition of STEM goes beyond what they see, and so that they can also be partner. I mean, we need all that thought partnership when they get older and start developing technologies that are going to support us all, right, in fighting the climate crisis and all of these things. So it's really important that we have folks who also understand that the stock story of STEM is beyond what they might be told. And the boys in our programs, I hope, are welcomed there, and also get a really interesting view of how they can collaborate with people who are different from them in STEM spaces.
Thank you. I appreciate that perspective, because it really brings to bear. I mean, if we look at just sheer statistics overall, right? Women or those that identify as women still make up about 51% of society, and yet in the STEM field in general, particularly in the hard STEM fields, hard being traditional like engineering in particular, it's still, as Tanisha says in the chat, it's still like 11-to-1 ratio, like And our last speaker in the last show, Roxanne Moore, was sharing that the higher educated she continued down her pathway and in her career, the more she was like the solo, woman in that field. So.
And this goes back to the folks around. What are the male identifying folks in that environment doing to make sure that they're creating a space where her thoughts, her partnership is all welcome? And, I think back to my time on Girls Inc., and people used to always say, well, what about Boys Inc.? And I would say, yes, we definitely need a space, a gender responsive space for folks who identify as boys as well. So I'm not, we focus on girls because we know those statistics at the end that you just mentioned. But there is something really important about gender responsive spaces, because boys do face their own challenges when it comes to how they're socialized in this world, So it hasn't been me who's been the person out there for those boys, but I do agree with you that we need a lot of spaces to help young boys grow up and be able to be emotionally secure, be able to be expressive, be able to challenge some of these stereotypes that they are mired in when it comes to what it means to be a boy. So I think while Techbridge Girls might not be that space, I look forward to seeing anyone who wants to launch a Boys Inc. To support boys and making sure that they're growing up supported, because all of us are beholden to these gender norms, stereotypes, and pressures that our society puts on us. And boys are no different in terms of that. Just how that shows up for them is very different.
Well, I like that. I think it goes back to your original philosophy of getting, approaching people from where they are and saying, okay, let's look at commonalities. Let's look at where things intersect and how we can grow together as, people and continue. So I appreciate that. There's so much to unpack. We do have a live show coming up in February. And that'll be really interesting. But I just want to take kind of our last 7 minutes or so here and just ask you, what's next for you? Like, you're here, you're advocating, you're helping with Techbridge Girls, you're changing the conversation on race, on gender equality, you're pushing the concept of, focusing a little bit more on girls being empowered, but also breaking down systematic barriers that stop that empowerment. I mean, you're doing it. So what's next?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I just got here at Techbridge Girls, and we're in a space where, we launched this new work around this, educators and working with adults and system change in the pandemic. So I'm here for it, and I'm excited to see where we go with it. And also, I think a lot about this partnership between nonprofits and private sector folks. Like, there's so much knowledge and skill in the nonprofit sector and so much in the private sector, and we very rarely intersect. And so I have been thinking a lot about that, not just in terms of how we prepare as nonprofits, how we prepare these private sector folks to welcome the next generation of young people as they enter the working world, but also how we just really share that knowledge between the two. We work so much, and obviously, like, private sectors fund a lot of this work, right? But they're not always good stewards of the missions and the visions of these organizations that they fund. So for me, I've just been very curious about those intersections, very interested in exploring them, not only for our youth, but how we really make true and lasting social change. Because we're going to need those people who are developing the software, who are making the shows and movies, to be partners in social impact. And we're going to probably need to do it better. And sometimes we don't speak each other's language. I know often when I'm talking to folks in STEM fields, they don't speak mine and I don't speak theirs, but it's really important that we start speaking some common language, because all of us are needed to ensure that we're really making true impact in the world. So I'm curious about all that. I'm curious about where Techbridge Girls sits in that. I'm curious about where all of us who are passionate about young people sit in that responsibility. That's what I've been thinking a lot about, but I'm here for it because Techbridge Girls, we have a long way to go when it comes to growing our group of advocates and educators who are committed to equity. So I'm in that for the hall too.
I love it. So if I think it's great. I think before I got into the education field and the after school field, I worked for a couple of corporations, and I could tell you it's easier. It would, as a corporation leader, I would have approved investing in a program that would prepare kids to work for my corporation or not, because ultimately it would help the field of what we were doing. It would be cheaper for me to do that than actually recruit people into my company, because it becomes a natural recruiting pool. Yeah. So that's a fascinating structure.
Yeah. I worked on internship programs in the past, and there was such power and opportunity for learning for our young people to go into fields and have on-the-job experience, and also for those folks in the field to listen to some young people and learn from them and understand where they're coming from, so that they can be more in tune with the direction that we're all moving and the generations that are coming after them. That mutual learning is so important. And I know there's a lot we can do at Techbridge Girls, but there's also a lot we can do in society to make sure our young people are prepared and welcomed to be part of these really important fields where there's economic opportunity and where there's opportunity to make this world a better place.
I love that. Well, let's close out. We got about 2 minutes here. So if I was to come back to you and just say, in a nutshell, what would you want everybody listening in today to walk away from this conversation? What do you want them to remember? If they could remember one thing, could you summarize kind of what's your power talk today that people are going to take away?
Maybe just that they have so much power in every interaction they have with a young person, whether it's, passing in the hallway or hosting them for a field trip, or, or being their teacher in the classroom. The power that you have to develop their confidence, to tell them a story about where they belong and who belongs in what, is so important in all of those spaces. And every interaction we come to, whether, no matter how tired we are, is one that should be thoughtful and authentic, because you never know 20 years from now what kid is going to be looking back and saying, that one time I spoke to Elizabeth or Jill, it got me here. So that's just what I try to remind myself all the time, and what I hope that we can all remind ourselves, because lesson plans are one thing, test scores are one thing, but usually it's those really authentic interactions with young people that make the difference.
Wow. Well, I thank you. Your message of, really, using our power and influence to create brilliance and help students really achieve is amazing. Your passion, your growth. I can't wait till our live talk show where we can actually have questions from the audience and people can interact with us and talk, and we'll see where it goes. So thank you, Jessica, for taking time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Shawn.
Yeah, no, it's great. With that, I think I turn the time back to Elizabeth to close us out.
Thank you both so much, Jessica and Shawn. This was another really amazing conversation. And again, just, reiterating the importance of a caring adult in a child's life and how what we say matters and whether we realize it or not. And sometimes we don't get that feedback, like you said, Jessica, until 20 years later. Sometimes they come back into our lives and say, oh, it was so important when you said XYZ to me. And we just have to remember that day to day. But again, fantastic conversation. Thank you both so much for your time. Thank all of you for joining us today. We know that your schedules are busy, especially this time of year. We want to say thanks again to the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for making this webinar series possible. If you do have a chance, please take a minute to fill out our survey. Your feedback is so important to us, and we hope that you will join us for this live conversation at the Beyond School Hours Conference. The registration is open. We will be in Orlando, Florida, February 9th through the 12th. This conversation, this live talk show, will happen on Saturday, February 11th, following the keynote presentation. It's a fantastic program. It's 4 days of professional learning and networking opportunities, and just a great way to recharge and get back to our kids with, some inspiration to head back to work. So please consider joining us. Thank you again for joining us today. We will not see you next week. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Get some rest, and we'll see you in December.